I'm going to go ahead and go into the main lecture right now about magazines. While people are still gathering, they probably won't, but they can watch the video if they choose to. And then I'll go back to, in a little bit, I'll start passing around the grades and discuss those a little bit for the major project 2 as we finalize our time here to prepare major project 3. So I just want to go through a little bit about your last project while some of you are still finishing up your 3rd project. I can pretty much guarantee that I will have no critique sheet hardly to refer to when it comes to the magazines because it's so hard to come up with a critique sheet for magazines. It's what's a good, what's your preference in a magazine is about as different as your personality, which is one reason why magazines are still thriving compared to newspapers even in America. And maybe not thriving might not be the best word for it, but at least doing better than newspapers because they have their own personality, they have their own followers that are unique to them. I mentioned before, at least in some of the tutorials in passing, that the age of the magazines, in some cases, some people might say the age of the magazine was more in the early 1900s, at least in America. Some of the most powerful magazines were developed during that time. But that was also a time when there were only a handful of magazines, basically, to really look at and to consider, and it wielded a lot of influence. There's no question about that. And so in that case, you might have in some ways could conclude that that was a golden age. But if you're going to actually look at it from, I think, a more statistical perspective, a more analytical perspective, you'd have to say the golden age started developing in the 1970s. Until the 1970s, as I said, there were, I think there were already about 10,000 magazines. I believe while I was working on in fact, that would have been even late 1970s, perhaps. I was looking at magazines, and I think one of the IRs, one of the main organizations that kind of tracks the media in America, I think I went there and found 10,000 magazines. And you say, well, that's a lot of magazines. In fact, that's about as many different magazines as there are newspapers. But now there are probably 100,000 magazines in America because it's only, well, to some degree they had started to specialize in those days. My master's thesis included a survey of both journalists and the readers, subscribers to some of the what you consider extreme magazines politically that were definitely different than the middle of the road magazines. And so I wanted to be able to analyze how they thought differently. And so I had 4 surveys that were intended to do these people really think differently? Do they think differently? Well, like one of the questions was, would you accept and read a magazine with which you strongly disagreed? I wanted to see if they were open to other ideas. I asked questions similarly, in that realm as to how open they were to other things. Then I had them, and this may be something a little bit redundant to what I may have told you in other classes, but I also wanted to ask them about, I wanted to see how strongly they felt, how strongly I started my literature review by reading reading scientific articles about the idea of dogmatism. Dogmatism is basically, by definition, is somebody who's tied to a dogma, tied to intellectually or emotionally tied to a particular philosophy or dogma. But the public understanding of the word dogmatism is more or less that these people are closed-minded. that these people are not open to new ideas. And I reviewed the developer of this idea scientifically had created basically a test, an exam, if you would, to determine who was dogmatic and who was not dogmatic. But as I went through his test, it was very clear to me that he was very biased against the extremes, just by the very nature of the way he was asking questions. Is that if your opinion strongly disagreed with the middle of the road, then by his definition you were dogmatic. And yet somebody whose opinions disagree at the middle of the road doesn't necessarily mean they're not open to new ideas, or that their commitment to their belief is necessarily that much stronger than those in the middle of the road. In fact, when I started looking at ideas of, there's a concept called groupthink, and I'd witnessed it as a university student as I became very politically involved, that there was an extreme group. It was an extreme group that was shutting down universities and stuff. They were willing to be militant and so forth. And I would go listen in on their conversations, and I realized their perception of the world was extremely different than mine as far as the reality of it. They were living in a different reality, and yet their reality was not shared by most people. Truth is, I don't know, maybe their reality was better than mine. But I did know this, that they were self-supportive, as a self-supportive system, and they were absolutely convinced that anybody outside their system was an idiot, basically. Enough so that when I debated their president, their vice president tried to come up and attack me physically because he didn't like what I was saying. And so their self-supportive system, their groupthink, was strong enough that it so convinced them that they were right, that some of them, including their vice president, was willing to be violent if somebody disagreed with them. We're seeing, by the way, a lot of that today, and especially in America, where it's become so divisive, and it's reaching now not just a small group. We're seeing very large groups in America that have that attitude. They're so sure that they're right that they're willing to be violent over it, to a degree that I've never seen in the history of America. It scares me a lot about that country's future. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, so part of my survey was of general interest newspapers and of special interest magazines. And so they certainly did exist in the political realm and in some other areas. And so some of those 10,000 were already quite special interest, but not to the degree that erupted in the late 1970s and into the 1980s and 1990s. By the way, I just kind of to cap off what I was talking about in my study, what I found, I asked some questions, and this is the part I probably have mentioned in other courses or other classes, but I kind of capped it off by asking them to predict the future. And I gave them something there's no way they could know the future about. I asked them, what will the American economy be like in 10 years? Well, economies change so rapidly, there's no way to really, and the experts all disagree with each other, there's no way to know for sure what the American economy is going to be like in 10 years. I can tell you right now, I have no clue what the American economy is going to be like in 10 years. It could be prosperous, maybe Donald Trump will succeed, or there's other people that are also conservative who say it's about to collapse as soon as October. We may see a collapse in the world economy. There are other people that are certainly in between those perspectives. Although actually Donald Trump said during the election that he wasn't sure he could save the economy. He was in bad enough condition. But anyway, there's really no way to predict that question. The other one I asked, and this was in 1978 when I asked this question, I asked them, what is the future of American-Soviet Union relations? Well, in 10 years, the Soviet Union was collapsing. And that was definitely not one of the questions, because nobody in America and nobody, as far as I know, in the whole world thought the Soviet Union was going to disintegrate in 10 to 12 years. But anyway, what I found that was interesting, and this is something I would, and sorry if it's redundant to something I taught before, but I'd urge you to consider that maybe you don't know everything. I know I don't know everything, but as a professor I have to act like I do. And I have to grade you like I do, because how else do I grade them except how I think? So when we go back to the newspapers, you may disagree with the way I grade you, but there's nobody else that can grade you in this class except me. That's just the reality of it. So every day we have to deal with people with opinions, and the opinions, you should be careful when you're trying to decide how to conduct yourself in a certain class or whatever, because the truth is the professor's opinion is the only one that really counts, in a sense, as far as your grade goes. So you need to know how the professor thinks and try to psychoanalyze him a little bit in order to get into his head to know how to get a good grade. But going back to what I was saying, so I asked them to predict the future, and basically they had 3 answers, but as far as I'm concerned, all 3 answers were just as equally possible by anybody who's not arrogant, because those were such vague questions, and trying to predict 10 years in the future. As far as I'm concerned, there's no way to be sure on any of the 3. But in each case, I said, will it get better, will it get worse, or will it be the same? And whatever opinion these thousands of people chose, their average was about 70% that they were sure they were right. They were sure they had a 70% chance of being right about their opinion in a question to which they could not possibly know. And so it was interesting. There was very little difference between a mainstream journalist and a special interest journalist and on the political fringe, or the mainstream public, or the political or the subscribers to the extreme public or political newspapers or magazines, excuse me. So that is, I think, a reality of our lives. I talked to you probably, if not in this class, in other classes, about how our brains, I like to compare it to the Erector Set I played with as a child. You might call it Legos aren't quite the same. You have a little more options with them, but when we were having to screw in these strips of metal to build things like buildings and Eiffel Towers and cars and stuff, at first, if you were building the Eiffel Tower, you'd have just the main pieces of metal screwed in, going up to the peak and down and up and down. And at that point, it's very wobbly. It could fall over quite easily. And then you start doing crossbars and maybe diagonal bars and more diagonal bars. And by the time you had all these pieces of metal screwed together, not just up and down, but cross and cross and cross and diagonal, now it became so rigid that you'd have to kick the thing to knock it down. And that to me is the way our minds work. That's the conceptual framework in which our brains work, that we develop one concept after another concept to the degree that one of the great scientific minds of our era actually is now, I think it's the 1950s when he wrote his book, but it's about scientific revolutions, and he pointed out that basically no scientific revolution. There's been lots, and there are always scientific revolutions going on as new theories answer questions the old theories couldn't answer. And so they're actually picking up more revolutions now than there used to be. So many revolutions, they don't call them a revolution anymore because they're happening so fast. But new ways, new perspectives of seeing things, even in hard sciences. But he pointed out that basically very few scientific revolutions have ever been conducted by older people, because older people have built their conceptual framework so rigidly, so strongly, and everything pieced together. They're very comfortable with the way they perceive the world. And then we have this notion of cognitive dissonance, where anything that disagrees with the way we see the world, it makes us feel extremely uncomfortable. And indeed, if we're presented with a new fact after we've created this conceptual framework, when we're created a new fact that does not fit, in other words, another piece of metal that we cannot fit into as we're putting together this Erector Set thing, we try to screw it in, it doesn't fit any place. We call that conceptually nonsense, because it doesn't make sense to us. It does not fit into our conceptual framework. And the older you get and the more rigid your conceptual framework, the less likely you'll be able to fit in concepts, and they will be rejected as nonsense, and you'll forget about them. They just don't make sense. They're nonsense. But that doesn't mean that they're not right. And the more nonsense you find that disagrees with your sense, at some point, some young person typically is going to say, maybe we just built this conceptual framework wrong. We've got to put it back together again so that all these little things that did not make sense start making sense. And that's the nature of a scientific revolution, or any revolution of ideas and concepts. Anyway, younger people are able to do that better than older people because they don't have a rigid conceptual framework yet. And they even did a test of university students, presented them with a revolutionary new idea. And they wanted to see if this idea was true, this idea of rigidity, what I called it in my thesis, idea of conceptual rigidity, how would smart students compare to dumb students? Because what you would expect is a smart student was to have a more rigid conceptual framework already. So even though they're college students, they thought a lot. They pieced their world together, one concept after another concept. And here are these students who don't study very much. They haven't done that. And so who would be more open to a revolutionary new idea? And indeed, along with the way I portrayed it in my thesis, and I would have projected, the dumb students were more open to revolutionary new ideas than the smart students. The ones that worked less, that spent less time studying, would accept a new idea, revolutionary new idea, faster than somebody who had spent a lot of time, even though they're still a college student, putting their conceptual framework together. So anyway, so going back to the magazine world, we had a lot of special interest magazines already in around 1980, but then it just, as they realized the financial benefits of a magazine that could find its own public, its own consumers. Another class, and if you took my history of communications class, I think I told you a little bit about Clayton Christensen. And Clayton Christensen is a Harvard professor right now, disrupting the world with his concept of disruptive innovation. And he's teaching how big companies are overthrown by small companies. And the key to one of the keys to his theory is that the small companies and new companies that are causing this revolution in business are coming in and finding what he calls non-consumers, people who are not being adequately serviced by the current powers that be, the big companies that are their competitors. And that's how they get in. They get in with the lowest level consumers and the ones that are not consumers at all, the non-consumers, and then they build their way up until they can defeat the giant, so to speak. And it's happening all the time, and we're seeing it more and more. And now, basically, the best minds in business have that are now looking at the world through the glasses of Clayton Christensen are seeing how all this, now over the ages they've seen these companies rise and fall and rise and fall and rise and fall, and they realize that his theories of disruptive innovation are spot on. They're explaining things that could not be explained before. Anyway, so as we gather our little tribes, you might say, as we find people with a common interest, the magazines have sought to serve them. And so there's a magazine for almost everything right now. They have their own public, their own consumers, and the dedication to that topic now has again caused, first off, during the previous decades, caused the magazine industry to erupt from 10,000 in America to 100,000 magazines. Some of them are local magazines, like the one I used to own and still have some ownership interest in, an entertainment magazine, a local entertainment magazine. And so it has its own consumers. And anybody in the city where I used to live that wants to know more about entertainment comes to our magazine. Because the daily newspaper, while they include a lot of stuff, it's mixed up with everything else in the world. And so you can't really go, and also being a daily newspaper, you buy it, and the routine of most people is buy it and they throw it out before the next day because now they have another newspaper coming. And so if they're a daily subscriber, they don't want to keep around more than one newspaper at a time. And so on Fridays is when they have advertising and stories about entertainment. By Sunday, it's gone. So you might, on Friday, look at the daily newspaper for entertainment. On the other hand, there's our magazine sitting out in a free stand by the grocery stores and a lot of other places, hundreds of different places. And they know they can go pick up our magazine, and it'll be there for a month. And everybody who wants to, anybody who's in the entertainment business, if they're smart, they're going to be advertising with our magazine. Because it's going to be there waiting for people to come pick it up when they're ready to read about entertainment. And they know they can go there anytime during the month and pick up the entertainment information for the next month or 6 weeks or maybe even 2 months. And so they can, they know where to find it, and that's our magazine. So that's one of the 100,000 magazines is a local magazine in a city of about 200,000 people, relatively small metropolitan area, but it's servicing the need of a certain portion of the public. I may have told you this story before, again, and probably did if you took the history of media from me, but let me reiterate a story because I think it gives you important background to this whole area of magazines. When I was teaching in Kazakhstan, I had my students, one of their assignments as a team was to find somebody to come speak to us, somebody who knew the local media better than I did. And so one of the teams went and found the publisher of a magazine that was all about beauty, women's beauty specifically. And so it was about hairstyles and makeup and wardrobes and so forth, clothing, but especially emphasized the head area, anyway, let me put it that way. Hair, especially, because they had one way of distribution, only one way of distribution. They had a nice, slick, beautiful magazine, and it was distributed only through beauty salons. Women would go to get their hair done and their nails done and their faces made up and whatever they wanted to do to be beautiful. That was the only way they distributed, was to take these, I don't remember, in fact, I'm not sure I know or ever knew exactly how many magazines they published. It might have been, it wouldn't surprise me if it was no more than 10,000 in a city of 2 million. But those 10,000 went only to one place and were aimed at only one sort of person, one consumer. Their distribution was very easy. They just had to drive around to the beauty salon to go drop off a stack of magazines. And the women that go waiting for their turn, or they might be in between, something was setting with their hair, well, they would have this magazine, this beautiful local magazine with local information, but also, general information about beauty, sitting right there to read, and they could take it home if they wanted to. And so they had cheap distribution to exactly who they wanted to pick it up and read it. And so one of the questions I remember in our class, somebody said, well, how is this was in, I think, 2010, maybe 2009 still. They asked, how is the recession affecting you? And I remember her response very clearly was, what recession? To her, there was no recession because she had found her niche market, and it was so rewarding financially that they were growing and making money hand over fist because they had almost the perfect combination of the perfect storm, so to speak, referring back to that old movie. Everything had come together for them, an easy, perfect way of distributing to exactly who they wanted to distribute to, with exactly the content they wanted, And why would an advertiser not want to advertise in their magazine? To advertise in a newspaper there would be crazy compared to advertising in that magazine. A woman is not going to look in the newspaper, at least, let me put it this way, the way you read a newspaper, the way you thumb through it, the way you go through it so quickly, the number of people seeing an ad, a beauty ad in a newspaper would be very small. They would not know to go there to look for it, so they would not particularly or specifically pick up a newspaper to look for a beauty ad. They would not spend much time with it probably because that wasn't what they had in their mind at the time. And so if somebody did put a beauty ad in a newspaper, it would have very little readership. And then again, the newspaper would be thrown away very quickly, and the magazine would still be sitting, if they picked it up from the beauty salon and took it home, it'd still be sitting there probably for at least a month, maybe 2 months, because it's made so nicely, it's slick paper, beautiful color, the information they want, they would not throw that away very soon. I have, well, my mom just recently died, and she had years worth of some magazines that they had subscribed to. There were things like National Geographic and Reader's Digest, things that had long-standing content that people might want to look at decades later, and she would not throw those away. Now, I'm not sure that the beauty magazine would fall in that category, but people hold on to things like that much, much longer. So your repeat readership might be in the years, not the days. So all of that has to be calculated when you figure out the value of an ad in that sort of a publication. So special interest magazines, I think, still have life by their very nature, and they're also more likely to be able to transition online when people decide that their mobile device is the way they want to read it. I think they might still go to their favorite magazine that's now transitioned online, whereas their favorite newspaper, I don't think is going to survive, at least not in the numbers that exist in America. Because again, we've got about 10,000 newspapers, and 10,000 newspapers are not going to retain enough readership to survive in America. And so far, they've been able to transfer less. In fact, on average, it's about 5% of their revenue is now coming from their online publications, and yet they're losing money. Most of them are losing a lot of money now, and so it's a matter of they don't want to give up. There's always hope, but the newspapers are just hanging on because they don't have a choice. I mean, they could just close their doors right now, but again, like the chain, one of the biggest chains in America was one that I used to work for, and I know I've said this before, but they were, in their last annual report, they were bragging about raising their online income by 10%, and they were just so happy about that. But then when you kept reading their annual report, you found out they lost $30 million in 1 year. And so how many years can you lose $30 million and still keep bragging about how you increased your online revenues by 10%? It's actually their enemy in a way that they're trying to survive with their traditional publications. Because the longer they try to survive, the longer they fight, the more in debt they'll go. And the more in debt they go, the less likely they can transfer. I mean, truthfully, if they close down all their, well, let me put it this way, if an organization had no debt, they could afford to close down all their print publications, fire a bunch of their employees, and their online publications would survive. Even with only 10%, that would still be millions and millions of dollars of a large corporation. And so they could still survive if they had no debt to worry about, and they didn't mind laying off about 90% of their employees. They could survive. But the longer they try to maintain their traditional publication, the further they go into debt, the less likely they'll survive in any form, because they'll be too far into debt to stave off their creditors. So anyway, magazines. that's the nature of the magazines right now, is a world of special interest. And anyway, so what is a magazine? Actually, everything here is probably not totally true. Magazines come out less often than daily newspapers, true, but so do weekly newspapers. So that's true. And weekly newspapers, by the way, are kept around the house longer than daily newspapers. That's one of the one of the studies that I hung on to as I tried to compete with daily newspapers with my weekly newspapers, is that ours would last longer, therefore they'd have more likelihood of repeat readership. Magazines are printed on better quality paper than newspaper and are bound. Well, but some magazines are published in lightweight, non-glossy look stock. In other words, my magazine, the one that I had in America, is on newsprint. We considered going to better paper, but it cost a lot more, and we didn't think it'd increase our advertising. So we stayed, lots of color in it, but we stayed with newsprint. We did not go to glossy. Magazines appeal to more specialized audience than newspapers, but what about the general interest magazines with broad appeal like Reader's Digest? Those are typically older magazines that came from the previous era, however. The general interest magazines are the first ones to be failing now, because they do not have their niche market. Magazines use extensive color photography and special layouts, but so do many newspapers, and there are some magazines without color. So again, it's not universal. Magazines tend to be held onto longer than newspapers, but so are weekly TV listings and advertising supplements that regularly appear in the newspaper. But those are all characteristics of many newspapers. So the odds that they fall into those categories, that they match some of those attributes, is greater, but it's not universal. I would say about the only one that is almost by definition universal is that they come out less often. That's really about the only one. And I'd say no magazine that I know of is in a broadsheet format. I had a magazine, a tourism-oriented magazine, when I was living in Arkansas, and that one I set up so that it was actually tabloid, but then when the tabloid was folded in half, the magazine, it looked like, the cover was one half of the tabloid. So it was basically more or less A4 size. When it was folded in half, it looked like a regular magazine, but when you actually picked it up, you realized it was a tabloid. So it might be tabloid. Our entertainment news magazine in America is tabloid. So tabloid, perhaps. Broadsheet, I've never seen one that would call itself a magazine. So it's going to be smaller than a typical American daily newspaper, which is typically broadsheet. But again, the main difference would be how often it comes out. Magazine staffing, like newspaper, commercial magazines have both their editorial side and their business side. Their business side, I've described some of the differences in their business and a newspaper. The fact that they're going the trends are towards specialized magazines, therefore specialized consumers. They have lots of different distribution methods. Some are paid, mail delivery, not very many doorstep delivery ones, but subscriptions, still a lot of subscription magazines. Others are just free pickup or paid pickup. If they're nice and glossy, then they're more likely to be sold. You're going to make some money. In fact, some magazines make a lot of profit off their sales, because a lot of magazines in America will sell for as much as $5 a piece, and so it's kind of like a small book. If they have a strong enough appeal, that's actually a good share of their profit is off of selling the magazine, because $5 is a lot for a mass-produced publication, even if it's slick, even if it's beautiful. $5 is going to get you in the profit if you have enough sales of that nature. So advertising obviously is still the dominant, provides the dominant support for most publications, at least in America. I'm not going to go through all of this, but we've gone through what the editorial organization looks like in a newspaper. It's not a lot different in a magazine, but you might have some, like I knew some of the editors for Rolling Stone magazine, and they would have contributing editors, and they'd give editor title to a lot of people who never showed up to the place, who were basically writers. But maybe they put in some input as to what the magazine should have been doing, and so they gave them the title of editor, and so they had a lot of contributing editors. So the role of some of these are different than in a newspaper. One thing that is consistent is you have staff writers, and you may have staff photographers, but more and more magazines do depend on writers and photographers who are not part of their full-time staff. And however, that was true for a lot of my newspapers too. I depended on a lot of what we call stringers who'd be paid for how much we printed, and not any more than that. And they would also bring in photos and be paid for their photos and stuff. There are different types of magazines. The two that jump out are consumer magazines and business magazines, and that's kind of the same as in business. We talk about B2B and B2C, business to business or business to consumer. Well, a consumer magazine is still a business, but trying to speak to the consumers. And so, is a consumer magazine really a consumer magazine? Even the question here, how about Consumer Reports? I don't know if you've ever seen that magazine, but it goes through and analyzes the quality of a lot of different products. So it may compare different cars, and they actually spend quite a bit of money testing a lot of consumer products. And so we call it a consumer magazine, perhaps in some ways the original consumer magazine, in the sense that it actually put it into its name, and it's been in existence for a long time, and it declared itself to be the friend of the consumer. But who supports the magazine? Who really pays for it? Mostly the advertisers, and especially advertisers who get a good report from the consumer magazine, the Consumer Report. So it's kind of sometimes hard to distinguish even those two small categories: a business magazine that is aimed at businesses, at business people, or a consumer magazine that's aimed, in theory, towards consumer. They still have very strong ties to businesses, no matter, because they're the ones that are paying for it. It mentions that magazines should be redesigned regularly so they keep up to the current styles, look like they're not old-fashioned and so forth. So maybe every 5 or 6 years they might do a redesign, because our public taste, we want something different, something fresh, and it's very easy. Although again, you can go back to Reader's Digest was mentioned. Reader's Digest is the highest circulation magazine in America. It has about 20 million subscribers, and it has a very small format. It's like half of an A4. So, like, again, fold the A4 in half, and it's actually a little smaller than that. Quite thick usually, and anyway, it's it does not redesign. It doesn't bother. It has its interestingly enough, it's always had its table of contents on the front cover, so you can immediately see what's inside the digest. They buy a lot of they pay other magazines to be able to take their stories and put them in their magazine, or they take books and pay the authors to let them digest, let them bridge their books into their digest. So basically the idea of Reader's Digest, which again is many decades old, was find the best information, best stories, and digest them into their small little book that you could stick into your pocket even if you wanted to, if you have a big enough pocket, or at least in your purse. So it's some magazines are not going to redesign very often by the way that they're very comfortable with the way they are, and they're very popular. So simplicity is a keynote in effective page design. That's the very nature, again, of most magazines. Again, not all of them, but most magazines, you're probably only going to have one story, at least towards the front part of the magazine. You might start having some digested sort of stories in the back, but towards the front, you're probably never going to have more than, or very rarely have more than one story on a page, and indeed, probably more than one page for most stories. So you might have 2-page, depending on the format of the magazine, 2-page stories, 3-page. Reader's Digest has stories that are, because of the way that I explained, they in some cases are digesting books. They may have some articles that are more than 20 pages long. That's unusual for a magazine, but for their purpose, it makes sense. But you certainly in magazines have multi-page stories. Thus, in your assignment, in your project, major project 4, I'm expecting you to do 4 or 5 pages and not have more than 2 stories. So suddenly the stories that you've been using will go down and move down to, maybe 1 story on 2 pages and 1 on 2 and maybe 3 pages if you use all the art you can come up with on them. And that may be your biggest challenge, is coming up with art, because in a lot of our subjects, we have not had great art. And you may have to go get some more art to make it look like it, to really have a magazine style layout. But that leads to simplicity, as it was mentioned, just by the very nature of they're small enough pages that you're not going to have more than one story on the page, and indeed 1 story over 2 pages or even 3 pages. Your first page might be almost all art and headline. Maybe none of your stories on your first page. If you have a good piece of art, you do your headline over the art, or the picture. You might have a blurb on it. You might have a subheadline on it, but you have no text on your first page, possibly. Very often, we'll get to this a little bit later, but they have layouts they call where they bleed off the page, and that means basically the color and the text, maybe not the text, particularly art, will go right to the edge of the page. And that's mostly done by just cutting the magazine. So the press still needs a certain amount of space to print on, and therefore once you're done printing, once you're done binding the thing, they put it on a big cutter and they cut off the edges until the print, the pictures and so forth, come right to the edge of what you receive. That's not how it was printed, that's how you receive it. So they cut off some of the magazine in order to make it bleed to the edge. And that's a popular format that you really can't really do, what you're, I guess you could make it look that way electronically, but it couldn't print out then. So if you print me a copy of it, you're not going to be able to print out and get it to bleed to the edge, because our printers won't do that. So I think that's what the main thing. Magazines use better paper than newspapers, typically, not always. So what does that mean to the editor? One thing that means that you can have better pictures, even smaller pictures in some cases, although still small pictures are not highly recommended, but you can have more fine art, if you would, whether they're photographs or other types of art. I've mentioned to you before, one reason why I tell you cannot use small pictures in a newspaper is if that were actually printed in newsprint, the small images would be really, a lot of the detail would be missing, because the ink on newsprint, because it's so cheap, it spreads. The ink spreads. It doesn't spread on glossy paper. And so the quality of your pictures are many times better, much better in a glossy paper than they are on a newsprint. They just simply don't hold up the detail in newsprint by the very nature of the paper. And so it's not necessarily the quality of the photos, it's not necessarily the quality of the design, it's all the quality, it's just the quality of the paper. You cannot put in the detail on newsprint. It's cheap paper to put out mass produce publication to get out to as many people as possible, as cheaply as possible. And so newsprint is cheap compared to other stuff. The reason why our entertainment newspaper did not go to better paper is it would cost, I think it was more than twice as much just to change the paper. Just to go from newsprint to a book paper was going to cost us twice as much to print. And while I like to say that paper and ink does not cost much, still, if you have a limited budget and you're fighting to make a profit, doubling your printing price is not the thing you're inclined to do unless you're sure that you can make it up in sales. Now, that's what we're really not sure about with that magazine. We've never tested that. We've never wanted to spend the money because even though it's making a profit, it's not much of a profit. And all that profit would disappear, so it's marginal enough in that small market that doubling the print price would put it in the red, and then it'd be kind of a matter of prayer that you would sell enough additional advertising that you could pay for that difference. So you have to be sure that the advertisers believe that their advertising would be more effective to put it on nicer paper. And I think the new publisher, editor-publisher does not feel that that's the case, and I didn't think so either, although I was tempted. I couldn't do it, and he can't do it. It's just too expensive to go to the higher grade paper. So we haven't. I'm not sure if this is a definition of simplicity. Some magazines are not as simple as others, but it's interesting nonetheless, and you have a large portion with one piece of art. I don't know if it's even would be called a simple piece of art. But you also, as you look in magazines, you start seeing more art that's not photographic art. Now, whether any of you can come up with something worth putting in that is that's not photographic, I don't know. And you're probably taking some chance to try, because if it doesn't look good, I'm the one that has to judge it. Anyway, so the goal of a designer, as you're designing your magazine, is to create an environment where readers find an assembly of interesting stories. Now, in case, again, you're only going to have 4 or 5 pages, so maybe 2 stories. So yours is a small part of the magazine that we'll put together when you're done. But nonetheless, you're part of that entire enterprise, so to speak. Your goal is to attract readers to specific stories as readers thumb through pages of a magazine. So your design, why will they stop at your page? Your page has to be something that has some that draws innate interest to it, and that will be your assignment, will be to do that. So you need to think a lot about this. I mentioned earlier, I'm not giving you I'm not giving you a critique sheet on this, because it's impossible to come up with a consistent critique sheet with magazines. They are so different. And so consequently, how am I going to judge your magazine? With my guts, so to speak. Do I like it? I don't know how else to judge them. They're just not enough consistent. I can maybe come up with some rationale for myself, but it's still going to come down to, do I like it? Do I think you came up with something that is artistically pleasing and well thought out, and does it attract my eyes? Does yours stand out compared to your competitors in this room and those not in this room? Will yours jump out at me and grab my attention? That's basically, get an A, that's what you're going to do, is reach out and grab my attention, and I don't know how you're going to do that. Some of you participated in the photography contest a couple of weeks ago. I don't remember many of you there, but anyway, it was interesting. They asked me and Lucianne and Chen Song to be the judges of a photography contest. When it came right down to it, the 2 top photos were about as diametrically opposed as they could possibly be. One was a beautiful young woman, beautiful color, background of the lake and these buildings here. She had pretty little stuff in her hair, nice makeup, beautiful face. It was colorful, beautiful, the definition of beauty. And the other one that actually won first place was black and white, of an old man driving, I'm not sure what they call it here. Maybe, I think it's one of these three-wheel things that they drive consumers around. And he was from Thailand, but anyway, you get the idea. There's not a lot of them around here. But they, driving people around, a little taxi, so to speak. And it had a mirror, so you could see his face in the mirror, his ruffled up hair, old, not well kempt. The background, when you looked out the window, was not necessarily a real beautiful scenery in the background. About as diametrically opposed two photos as could possibly be. The most beautiful, and then one that was just interesting and different. One of the few that was black and white. One that it looked like is historical in nature. It sent me back in my mind back to the 1950s, 1940s, photos like from that era. So magazines are kind of like that. And what's going to appeal to me is kind of those two photos. The one that old style, black and white, something that you don't see very much anymore, and then the beautiful. So I don't. Again, I would be very hard pressed to tell you how to impress me. I don't know, because those were two of my favorite photos, and others that were in my top 10 were likewise quite different, Some had a lot of action, some didn't have a lot of action. So I don't know, and that's the way magazines are. It just has to appeal to you. Obviously, you want to hold the reader's attention. Some of you have tried doing subtitles in your news stories. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work. You don't really use subtitles in a newspaper very much unless you have a lot of gray area, a lot of text to work with. And so most of you didn't even try. It was hard for me to penalize people who did try, but in some cases they'd have on the front page only one subtitle. What almost defeats the purpose to have any subtitle if you only have one subtitle. And so you need a little more gray area to break up when you start using subtitles. And you would have that in the magazine, because you've got 2 to 3 pages for each story. So subtitles become more important in magazines than in newspapers. The use of color with headlines. Headlines are not normally colorized in newspapers. Actually, with my migrant newspaper, I did colorize. Partly in order to show the difference. I'd have one color for the pages that were in Spanish, and a different color for those that were in English. So it kind of, over a period of time, kind of helped them figure out which page is mine, so to speak. But it was small. It was a small format. It's more of a magazine format, actually, because it was a small tab, only like 12 inches tall and 10 inches wide. So it was almost square in its layout. In some ways, was a little more like a magazine, and I typically, most of my pages had only one story on them. And so in that respect, it was more like a magazine. And indeed, it was only quarterly. Only came out once every 3 months, is what they wanted it to come out. So it was a newsprint. It could have been called a magazine. I could have made it more magazine looking if I'd wanted to. I'd say it wasn't a magazine only because I didn't lay it out and make it look like a magazine. So I didn't make it look like a magazine. I could have. Maybe I should have even. Anyway, you design for readability and so forth. Values of design overall. You want to keep your magazine interesting. Some of this is redundant, but anyway, so some of the things you see here is different column heights, different column widths, different ways of headlining. They don't have too much here, but more likely to have blurbs and pull-out quotes, things like that, to help keep the interest in your layout. Your photos might be kind of, this one has the art kind of strange and dispersed. Possible. I don't know that you will have that sort of art that you could do that with. You'd have to go get some new art if you were, because I don't see that with what we have now. Again, you have different ways of laying out as far as trying to, you may try to do some cutout. One of the videos that you were supposed to watch about QuarkXpress showed you how to do cutouts, and maybe I'll get to that. But we're so running out of time, and I'll be gone 1 week out of the next 3. I kind of doubt that I got time to review doing cutouts with you. Each newspapers or each desktop publishing system is slightly different in how they do it. And frankly, I haven't done a lot of cutouts. I'm not sure I've ever done a cutout with Quark. So that means I have to learn how to do it. But I do remember there was one of the videos by the official instructor from Quark did teach how to do that. So I'd end up going back and watching the video again if I'm going to demonstrate it, because I haven't actually done it with Quark. I've done it with PageMaker, I've done it with InDesign, done it with other desktop publishing systems, but I don't recall doing it with Quark ever. So, and I know I haven't done it in the last 20 years, so that I do know. Anyway, so again, you see some different types of layout, and you see imposition you see some interesting art. I don't know how you might come up with some more interesting art for what you have, but that is probably one of your challenges, is how, since a magazine is more art-oriented, and we really have bad art for our stories by and large, what are you going to do about that? I don't know. I say those that are going to jump out and grab my attention are those who have figured out a way to make their art more than just what we have now, or handle it in a more powerful way. Now, some of you are lucky enough to have better art than others. But on the other hand, some of you already have a very limited, you end up having 3 stories on the same subject. Actually, that kind of helps you, because now you can bring the art from all 3 of the writers together and use just the best art that 3 different writers brought together, because you have one subject to cover. And indeed, you might use that one subject for all of your 4 pages. Because again, 4 pages is basically, for A4 would be 1 broadsheet page, and some of you have that much in one subject, so you may keep it one subject. I won't necessarily oppose that if you do a good job. Anyway, so sometimes they do, some of their art is very much related to their text, their type, and so like the one with the big W, they play a lot with their type, not with just photographic sort of art or illustrations. They use lines more. While I've been trying to break you from putting lines every place with my particular style, now with magazines you may tend to use, when you talk about type rules, you're talking about lines, basically. And so where do you put lines? How do you use lines? How do you use boxes? How do you use type inserts? Now you're starting to try to do this stuff in a more artistic way. Bleeding I talked about. Bleeding goes right to the edge, but typically that's done with a cutter. You really don't. I mean, you can do it with Quark. Go right to the edge. You just leave no margin, and so you can make it look like you're bleeding. And I guess the problem is I'll probably ask you to print it out for me again. And once you print it out for me again, you're going to lose some of your bleed. But it's turned out to be a lot easier for me to do my grading when I printed your pages out. It's just easier for me to kind of mark things up and then kind of evaluate it after I've marked everything up. A little more scientific than trying to do it and trying to remember everything in my mind as I look at a PDF and give you a grade. It was hard to divide it into 5 different major criteria, so to speak. On this page, there's a HTML on this page where you just go look at a lot of different typefaces, and this actually is a picture of that page. And as you go down, though, they show you about 100 different typefaces. I'm not going to bother to go through that. We've talked about typefaces. We've had presentations on it as it relates to newspapers. With magazines, you might look at more styles. You're still going to have some sort of, you have to have some style rules, but those rules would be broken more often when it comes to typefaces. But it's hard to imagine a magazine that would go routinely from sans serif headline to serif headline to sans serif headline to serif headline. You're probably not going to have a lot of that. You're going to have some rules, style rules you're going to set for your own magazine. But I'm not going to set any for you. So in this case, your pages may look quite different from one another because some of you may decide to go sans serif and some may go serif. Newspapers don't do that, and it was important for me to teach you, you have to keep a style. And we're going to put your tabloids together into one newspaper. They have to look like they were done under a certain style sheet, which they won't because a lot of you broke the style. But anyway, hopefully with your tabloids you won't have done so as much. Again, another demonstration where a lot is done with the type itself. And you intermix the photos, and you can put one over the other. You can put a photo over the type, you can put type over photos. You start interacting your type and your graphics a lot more. And all this is possible on Quark. That's no big deal with Quark. You know, that's one of the things you can look at. Again, we talked about line spacing. A lot of you are still having trouble with that. Some of you got downgraded quite a bit because you somehow came in with almost double spaced on your line spacing, not a newspaper type line spacing. And somehow you didn't see that or understand that from what I'm trying to teach you. Line spacing by default by Quark is about 20% more than the size of the type. So again, a 10-point type like our body text in the newspapers would be 12-point line spacing. But they take care of that usually automatically unless you overwrite it, or if you didn't get rid of the hidden coding from Word when you brought it in, and Word brought in double spacing. And so in several lectures I tried to teach you to how to get rid of that coding that might sneak in from Word. And you have to be careful of that. Again, this shows some different line spacing. The good, the normal up at the top. Some of you started squeezing. For some reason I found some really tight line spacing in some of your tabloid, or some of your broadsheet, broadsheet work, where you got rid of all the line spacing. It's way too tight. And then, but more often I found type like the bottom one where it's far too much. And again, I don't know why that happened, whether it was coding that came in from Word or what, but particularly the bottom, the too much was much more frequent in some of your work than the normal, or from the too tight. But once in a while I saw the too tight version as well. In magazines you avoid that just as much as in the newspaper, and maybe more so. Again, type rules are just basically lines, but used for a purpose. So you set off one part from another part. Again, some of you have already been doing that sort of stuff instead of boxes, even though you were supposed to use boxes. And so you start with the magazine, though. It's totally fair game. I don't care. However you want to do it. Again, different ways. You could take a piece of art like this and break it into pieces, or there's so many different ways of handling it. This is where you might want to get into Photoshop or the free IrfanView that I told you about, IrfanView. I have talked to you about that. If you don't have access to Photoshop, IrfanView is a very nice freeware that in some ways I even prefer over Photoshop. But it does most of what You meant that there are YouTube videos on how to use it. It might take you a little while to learn to do what you want to do, including cutouts. You can do cutouts with Earth and View, like you can Photoshop. So it's good for lots of things, and it's free, which is good if you don't have any money, or if you don't want to part with your money for that purpose. Besides the photos, of course, illustrations. You might be able to find some that fit your subjects and incorporate illustrations. I'm not, you know, I didn't know how to handle before, and I won't know now how to handle artwork of this nature that is copyrighted, and I'm not going to take time to go try to find out if it's copyrighted. I asked you not to use illustrations that were copywritten or photos that were copywritten. But many of you, I think, did, but I didn't have a good way to check up on you, so I didn't. So I let you get away with it because I knew I couldn't do much about it. Again, some different layouts, different ways of approaching things, but you need art to do it with. You need to think about it. And again, just like I said before, with the art that, or with the photographs from the photo contest, you choose different ways of doing things. Black and white has a different impact than color does. Some can be made into a combination of art and illustration. That is possible even with Earth and View. You could do your photo twice, do it once in high contrast, do it once in regular color, and then piece the two together. If they're exactly the same size, you could do a cutout of one and put it on top of the other one. And so this one in Life magazine down the lower left, you could do that with using Earth and View. Again, whether you're going to want to take the time to do it is a whole other issue. We talked about the four-color process. In printing, it's typically cyan is the blue, magenta is the reddish, yellow, and black is the CMYK. I don't know. Anyway, cyan, magenta, yellow, black. K is black. Again, all colors aren't necessarily in the photographs. You can use colors in other ways with a magazine, but do it well. And again, I don't know what instructions to give you in that regard, because what's well? What's well is what I like, and that may vary a lot. So ultimately, when it comes down to it, an editor has to believe in themselves. And so you kind of have to decide what you like. And if you like it enough, you have to believe that I will like it. That's in essence what every editor has to do. They have to believe in themselves that if they like something, that other people will like it. Because you have no way, I mean, you can kind of try to pretend that you're somebody else, so to speak. You can look at how other people lay things out, and you try to copy them. And to some degree, I suppose we all do it. All of us that are designing publications, we do learn from other people. But we still are uniquely ourselves, and ultimately we have to judge it. Even if we try to copy somebody else, it's because we like what they're doing. So it's still, we're just seeing that they're doing it better than we did it. And so we're trying to copy how they did something that was more pleasing to us than what we were doing, and so we start adapting our layout and our design. Background screens. You can do this with Quark. You can come up with a background screen and put text over it. So this is something that's very easily to do with Quark. That could be quite impressive, but again, it depends on the stories you have, and I'm not sure you have stories that will fit this, but just keep it in mind. See, I'm running low on memory again on my computer. I'm going to have to kill a bunch of stuff out. A lot of that's because of all your stories. I have to get them out of my computer and put them into my hard drive as soon as possible. Anyway, a lot of you use drop caps. A lot of you use drop caps. Some of you did them improperly. Instead of drop caps, you tried to just highlight the first letter and make it big. But when you made that big, using just the regular font size, You gave it new line spacing too, so your first line was bigger than, had more line spacing than the subsequent lines, so that looked really bad. So you can't do it